grandfather, T.C. Johnson, this is his chair I'm sitting in, by the way, came to Wimberley back in the 1890s, and he brought his family of 6 children up here, one of them being my mother. And so he and my mother and the rest of the gang spent their childhood in Wimberley every summer and Christmas and Thanksgiving and holidays. And my father, during World War I, met my mother in San Marcos, and he began coming to Wimberley in 1917. And they were later married in 1919 in San Marcos. So my family actually bought the land we're on in 1940, surrounding the land that my grandfather had bought before I was born. In the 1920s, the family had property down on Blue Hole, down the hill here, and grandfather would always get out on the Dripping Springs Highway and said, "I believe I'll burn a few cedar stumps and improve the road a little," and he'd say, "Hop out, Bill, and help me." And I would be 3 or 4 or 5 years old, and I would be hauling sticks and stumps. We were clearing a roadway down here, and the country cedar had been chopped and burned, and there was it was pretty sorry looking country in those days, lots of stumps, but we were making a road, and that was in the 20s. Yeah. Well, we had such a big family, most of the relationships were with the family, except we had to go to town, and that's where I really got interested in Wimberley, and that the people were interesting. The domino games were exciting. The people whittled initials on the benches, and every now and then a car would pass through, but very few. It was really, and the square was dusty and dirty, and it was a hot, dry time that I remember as a kid. But my interest was in history of Wimberley came about listening to Joe Crews talk. And Joe Crews talked as if he was with his father and his grandfather, because he knew their stories better than they knew. And he had a big voice and commanding presence, and he wanted to tell everybody about the Civil War and the Battle of Plum Creek, and he did. He was good. I don't know how much truth there is in it, but I believe him. And who's going to differ with it? Santa Anna Crews was his father, and Bill Crews and George Blackwell were partners working for McKinney and Maverick. Mavericks of San Antonio, handling their cattle in Hays County. Well, actually, this area, which was part of Travis County, I think, and before Blanco County split off. But Joe said their cattle went all the way from what is now Bergstrom Air Force Base to Wimberley, and they built a log fort over there near Driftwood, where they would keep their supplies, and because their job was protecting the cattle that belonged to McKinney and Maverick from the cattle thieves and from the Indians. And so it was a fight, and they were fighting people. They enjoyed the challenge of winning. We swam up and down the creek, and Blue Hole we liked the best. And we had, I think Dudley Johnson put a swing up in the big tree down there in the 1890s. And that was certainly fun until they began manicuring the park over there and cutting limbs off that we used to hang on to reach out. But Jacob's Well was the intriguing thing, and there was nobody around that seemed to know very much about it. And Preston Conley and Reed Conley and I got a hot water heater. We cut it off and put a glass plate in it so we could see. We made a diving helmet out of it. In those days, there were no aqualungs that had come to Texas that we knew of. And so we had a garden hose connected to the top of the hot water heater, and we had a tire pump, bicycle tire pump. And but the air tended to float the helmet off your shoulders, so we had to strap it on and weight it down, and then we had to carry rocks to go down into the well because the water was coming up 6 or 8 inches above the surface, bubbling out. There was a lot of water pressure. But those days were fun in that we were typical of a bunch of 10, 12-year-old kids playing with each other. We'd quit pumping when somebody would get down low, and that sort of thing. But you could dive in head first and without your feet getting wet because you were there was so much pressure coming up. Oh, with Buck and Kitty Wynn and Clarence and Pansy Burdette sitting right on this porch in what was that, 1948 or 49, they talked about having a church where their grandchildren could worship. And we had, at that time, the Little Christian Church, which is kind of a non-denominational church. Whatever preacher happened to come by, that was what denomination was there, and I guess the Baptist. But they were looking for a church that wasn't against things, that was for things. That may be a cruel way to word it, but it's kind of true. And but we met at Roy Avey's Chorale Theater one night, and we had, I've forgotten the figures, I could read it, but 17 denominations represented. And we had a lot of conflicts to work out, but the people that were there wanted a church and wanted to work it out. And the biggest problem was the Church of Christ wanted communion every Sunday, I think it was. And another group didn't want music, instrumental music. And anyway, that was all worked out, and so we had church on the square. At that time, the Johnsons owned the north side of the square, and where the Bowmans have a shop now. What do they call it? Blue Willow. Joe Springs with Nay Walker had quit running a garage filling station, and we cleaned up the grease and moved the gas pumps, and we had the church there with the Sunday school and the Saunders house next door. I went to the University of Texas and got a degree in geology, and but I didn't want to go to Odessa, Texas, or Maracaibo, Venezuela. And so MF and I decided it'd be more fun to be poor in Wimberley. So we were. But I got a job managing a farm and managing a ranch, about which I knew nothing. And I figured, though, if I'd been to Texas, Aggies took 4 years to learn. I figured I could learn in 6 months everything I needed to know. So I've been at that ever since then. My wife, MF, was complaining about something the other day, and I said, well, don't you remember when somebody wanted a carpenter and they would ask somebody on the square if they were a carpenter, knew a carpenter? Yes, I'm a carpenter. or a plumber, or an electrician, or a brain surgeon. It didn't matter what it was. But before we had the influx of more talented people, everybody did everything for themselves. I don't really know, but I don't think anybody got a loan to borrow money to build a house. We just went to work and built a house as we could afford it, and using materials that we would get from the dump. The dump was a trading area in those days, before we have the formality of government and rules and regulations. And the dump was where you would go to get spare windows or doors or whatever. Somebody would be cleaning up and changing. That picture on that book of a gate, James Holland, who was on Rancho Sema, gave me that oak wood in 1950, and I made a bunch of gates out of it. And I had helped him build a rock shed for his goats, and I'd driven his bulldozer some over there on Cedar. We traded around, just neighbors, and that was really a wonderful way to live, where we weren't worried about money. And you know that volunteer spirit is still in Wimberley. The people that have troubles, there's somebody that will organize benefits, and somebody will cook barbecue, and others will play music, and they'll have sales, and it's thrilling to see the Wimberley volunteers in action. The blacksmith shop had gone, and I remember the north side of the square before Forrester's came, which is now Cypress Creek Cafe and used to be the Dinner Bell. But Forrester's was done after the war, I think, in '46. But before that, seems to me there were a couple of little buildings, a little store and a barber shop, and there was a horse pen, cattle pen or something over there. Clarence Burdett, when he was 17, and he's been dead 10 or so years, and he would have been about 90 or 100 now. But as a 17-year-old, he and his father bought 100 horses in Refugio, and they drove these wild horses, unbroken horses, to Wimberley, and took them about a week. But when they got to Wimberley, there was a corral there, and they ran them in, and that was the first good night's sleep they had, with the horses well penned up. They had a little grocery store, and then in 1929, and then it did well. They had a big sign that said Burdett Cash Grocery, and that meant everything but cash. Nobody had any money. One time in 1910, I think it was, grandfather T.C. Johnson, they were camped at Rio Bonito now. It was Camp Wimberley or something at that time. But he bought a wagon full of firewood for his family to cook on while they were there that summer. They stayed all summer. And he paid man $1 for that wagon full of firewood. And the next year when he came back, he told him he wanted another load of wood. And he paid him. He said, "You know, Mr. Johnson, that's the first cash I've had since a year ago." Money was not used. It was trading, exchanging. And before World War II, we worked for each other, and we would try to get ahead of the other fellows so that he would help you. And so I knew that firsthand, because I was trying to build a house, and we seemed to have a child every year. I don't know where they came from, but they kept filling up whatever we'd built. There are a new set of people that MF and I keep trying to teach how to be a volunteer, and how to be a part of the community, not a problem for the community. It does keep changing, but the people that move in are good people, And you and I have been here a long time, and we understand things that we don't even have to talk about. We understand each other. But some of the newcomers don't understand where our thinking. And when they move in and think they will help Clemmy and Bill by changing the system and putting a road right through our pasture, or a telephone line right out the kitchen window where my wife can look at a post every time she's in the kitchen, you know, they think that's progress. But you and I don't. And Buck Winn had an airport.
He had the airport, okay.
And when we had bought this land we're on now, and my mother and dad had a radio program traveling out of New York, but traveling extensively in a couple of 3 continents. They wanted an architect to design a house, and they told what they wanted in a house, and Buck Winn said, "Oh, I've got a good architect friend, and I'll tell him to come on over." And so O'Neill Ford, who became quite a famous architect in San Antonio, storing the missions and building La Villita and so on, began flying in. But he would buzz us real low and drop things out, and then go land at Buck's pasture, and we'd go pick him up. And he would come over, and we'd discuss what we were doing. And that was really fun.
I bet that was a lot of fun. Well,
Buck Winn, by the way, when he had a stroke and they told him he couldn't drive anymore, he shrugged his shoulders, and he'd go out to Nellie Bell, his little airplane, and he'd go flying. They wouldn't let him drive.
so
He'd
he
fly.
couldn't drive, so he could fly.
Yeah, they didn't say he can't fly. We enjoyed Buck and Kitty and their Tinka and Jim. Before MF and I were married, we were married in '47. When she wanted to come out for me, well, she would stay with the Winns, and we did things a little differently in those days than is done now. But so MF got to know them real well early also.
They were really nice people.
Buck was a lot of fun. He, when we talked about where we're going to build a church, he said, "Let's put it on top of Baldy and eliminate the casual Christian." I've heard about 5 people that started the first market day, and it does go, and then it does die, and it does begin again, so maybe that's true. But I found a letter a month ago. My uncle Tom Johnson, who had land here also, wrote about spending a cold night on the creek where he was freezing. He camped out down the hill here. The next morning they drove through the square, and one of the Jep Henson was directing traffic. They had a traffic jam. They were having a benefit to raise money to buy a piano for the school. And so they had people selling things, and they were giving the money to the Buy a Piano Fund. And I thought about, that was in '24, I think. And then I know my mother started the market day, or whatever they called it at that time, on the square, where everybody came in their pickup and had things in their pickup that they had made. It wasn't any commercial stuff. It was all
Only jelly,
a lot of
bread.
preserves and quilts, and yeah, and Ms. Monette and a bunch of pottery that she had made, and we began getting a few artists in about
They had all the fresh
1950.
vegetables you could go buy.
Oh, and the food, yeah, that was the good part. Well, I was amazed at the amount of rock walls. Do you have them up in your neck of the woods? And so I was trying to figure, that's an awful lot of hard work, and how did they get there? And then if you read the figures, about a third of the county population were slaves before the Civil War. I thought, well, maybe that was the slaves that were doing that. And then I began looking into that, and all of the slaves were on the cotton fields out on the prairie, as my grandfather used to call it, on the San Marcos side. So they were all done by the ranchers, stock farmers who were living here. And part of it was to get the rocks out of the field, and part was to keep the cows from getting in the field. But they did an awful lot of stacking. And John E. Harris, who's to me the dean of the rock bin of the area, told about his father. He charged 25 cents a linear foot for a wall 4 feet high and 2 feet wide. And that's a lot of work, but he could do 5 feet and make $1.25 a day, and the going price was $1 a day for the average worker. So he was beating the system by working hard. He probably had all of his kids working too. But you know, out of that, we built what is now the Bowen Elementary School, and we hired Harold Bowen as a principal, and he was there for 26 years, and every year the school building was in better shape at the end of the year than the beginning, because at the beginning of the year he had all the students clean the school, every mark on it. And so all during the year, the kids wouldn't let anybody mess it up because they knew they were going to clean it at the end of the year. And but the Bowens lived in the back pasture here, and he used to bring the whole school. We had 4 classrooms. We had 8 grades in 4 rooms, but they would come down and picnic and swim in Blue Hole every year. And talking to Becky Shands, she remembers some of those early days when she used to crossing Ranch Road 12 in those days was no problem. There was an occasional car, but just occasionally. But Harold Bowen made a big dent on education because nobody ever failed, because he wouldn't let them leave school until they had caught up with whatever they were lacking, and then he would drive them home. But he wouldn't let them go home until they caught up with whatever it was they were minus. Susie Danforth is somebody we need to talk about and talk about. Susie lived, I was gone in the Marine Corps during the war, and my folks were traveling, and Susie was living here on the place with, what's the name of her horse? Not Lady Bird. Anyway, she would not live without a horse or two around, but she was such a character, and she was tough. She could handle anybody, anywhere, anytime, including Carl Scudder and forgotten his buddy's name. The school board said they didn't have indoor plumbing when they were students, and their children didn't need them any more than they did. So Susie said, well, we'll do it ourselves then. So she got Carl and his friend to dig the septic tank or the drain field after school, the 3 of them working away. They were the 2 biggest boys. And there was a lot of hustle there because there wasn't a lot of money there. By the way, when World War II came and I left, that was about the time Eagle Rock started, now called Wood Creek. But we had a family that came in with some money, and they helped the community a whole lot. They bought the store from the Burdettes. They headed up a lot of projects, and we had the highest war bond per capita income of any town in Texas. Wimberley did. And Dave Crumley's hat one time was auctioned off and sold for $5,000 during the war, and that was $5,000 was a lot of money then. There were really, the atmosphere in Wimberley now, as it was in the old days, has always been more special than the other towns around, in my unprejudiced opinion. But during World War II, everybody joined the service, and we were proud to go. We fought for the country. I joined the Marine Corps because my father was, he was a competitor. He was an athlete in college, and he liked a good fight and wanted to go kill the Germans in World War II. So I joined the Marine Corps so I could get in the middle of it and stand up to my dad. And I got shot on Iwo Jima, which was an interesting experience, but it was with a good team. It's kind of like Wimberley is a team. Those of us that want to join the team are together. We're in a battle. Well, Clemmy and I represent the old timers in Wimberley, and it's kind of a team. We don't have a meeting, but we know each other and we respect each other. But I had been interrupted by the war, and I ended up at the University of Colorado in the engineering detachment and got married, and MF and I went to the University of Oslo, Norway to have a good adventuresome honeymoon, so that was interesting. But back to Wimberley, to summarize some things, I started talking about slavery and the rock walls and how people worked. In studying old papers and reading materials that I've had in the closet and just thinking about some of the San Marcos people, there is quite a difference between Wimberley and San Marcos. And in my mother's day, there were, I think, 5 gates to come to Wimberley. You didn't run to San Marcos too often. You didn't need anything that they had. When I was a kid, you had to back up the big hill if you had a Model A Ford, so the gas, you had to have the gas above the motor. And it had if you backed up, you could have the gasoline work. But anyway, San Marcos and Wimberley are different. The people in San Marcos have the black land that will grow things. It's very rich land, but Wimberley has sorry, rocky hills full of cedar, and it's a tough place to make a living. But why did the people come here? Well, San Marcos was civilized before Wimberley was. And the people that came here, like the Blackwells and the Cruises and the McQuestians and some of those early people, weren't afraid of a fight. And they worked hard. Being a stock farmer, most of them were that settled here, a lot of trail drivers and that, but they had a real fight for an existence, and I think we need to appreciate the pioneers who settled in this rough country, because that black land was out there, but they didn't like it. They liked the adventure of having rock and cedar and animals, and most of all, the clear water that we're having a busy time protecting now to maintain the quality of our water. So Wimberley is a group of good, tough people, the basic Wimberleyite, and we're working on training the newcomers and teaching them that this town is worth fighting for.